Well, there we are, Professor. As always, I appreciate your time on the program. And thank you so much for your time and wisdom once again. This is your third time on my program. And, you're the first person to do that. And so thank you again for all your time and wisdom. I really appreciate it.
Man, I'm honored. I come here to learn from you, man.
So as I shared with you when we met years ago, I've been a longtime student of philosophy. And in 1999, I bought a book called Philosophy for Dummies. And Turns out you were the author. And when we met, many years later, I told you when we met, I was like, hey, I just want to thank you because what you did, specifically framing philosophy, which is really big and macro and sometimes heady, you did a great job of helping me. And at the time, I was studying the Greeks. So I was studying Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, and your book helps frame the Greeks and why they were so important and what they did specific to philosophy in general. But even bigger than that possibly was I was also mired in some pretty heavy stuff around Kant and Hegel and Kierkegaard and Bertrand Russell. And like you did an even better job of making those theories more approachable for me, specifically like breaking apart some of the ideologies and why they worked and why they differed. And so I just wanted to thank you for that too, because Bertrand Russell is still one of my favorite philosophers. I think I've read, I don't know how much, but a lot. And today, actually, where is the book? Well, I have it over there. It's Stoicism. You have it.
Oh, you mean this book?
That one. So now this is the newest one, Stoicism for Dummies. And just published this bad boy. And I just finished it, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then I called you up and I was like, hey, let's talk about that one because it was awesome. It's now adorning my bookshelf where I'd get up and give it for you. But so thanks for that. Thanks for being a public philosopher, which for my listeners that don't remember you actually left your tenured post at Notre Dame to be a public philosopher and go and talk to corporations and different organizations specific to the importance of philosophy. So thank you for that. And I know they thank you as well. So I also couldn't get into Notre Dame. So this is my workaround. Try to work with one of the most cited professors in the business. And
that's funny. And these stories intertwine in so many ways, like the Dummies book. It was because I had become a business philosopher and I'd just given a talk to 2,500 drugstore executives at the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach, Florida. And they got so excited about philosophy. And then a week later, I get a call from a woman saying, hey, I was in your audience down in Palm Beach and my boyfriend's executive vice president of a big drugstore chain. And you got to do Philosophy for Dummies. I'm the acquisitions editor for all the Dummies books. You got to write Philosophy for Dummies. I said,
that's how it happened.
I said, you guys do gardening books. You do car repair books. She said, no. Listen, yes, that's our history. But our future is this. We want to do lifetime learning for the world. And we've asked Thomas Hoving, the curator of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, if he will do art for dummies. And he's just agreed. If you will do Philosophy for Dummies, you and Hoving, Tom and Tom, will launch our new lifetime learning enterprise. I said, look, I'm honored to be asked. I'll turn my Notre Dame intro philosophy course into that book with no intended commentary on my students. They were all very smart, but it's all, like you said, it's all a matter of breaking it down. What were the philosophers really interested in? What as human beings were they really trying to get at? How can we use that in our lives now? A younger philosopher I know at Furman University, a guy named Aaron Simmons, is just starting to go out and speak to business groups. He asked a group yesterday, how many took a philosophy course in college? Half the group raised their hands. How many of you had a good experience? 2 of them raised your hands. He called on him. He said, why'd you have a good experience? Well, it was this great professor at Vanderbilt. He names this guy. It was Aaron's own professor at Vanderbilt. And then the other woman said, I was at Notre Dame and I had this philosophy professor named Tom Morris.
There you go.
I said, that's a small world, isn't it?
It is. And that's exactly what I want you to do with our listeners today, is because I want to get your take on the Stoics, specifically the origin, some of the most notable advice, and then tie some of these beliefs to our current culture of politics, even chat a little bit about how philosophy could possibly help what ails us as a body politic. And obviously we can just kind of riff on that because it's really important. So one of my all-time favorite philosophers was Marcus Aurelius. And Meditations was, I don't know, I think it was probably, and I didn't even know this until years later, but I really attached to it because it seemed really authentic And
Yes.
what I learned later, and I think you might even taught me this, is that it was more of a diary. It was like a personal journal for him. And when he did that, he was kind of like, I need to improve on this and I need to improve on that. And I need to be more virtuous in these areas. And then bigger than that, and I heard this on one of your interviews for your book tour, was you thought, and as did your co-author on the book, that part of that's importance to the Marcus Aurelius Meditations publication was that he forgave himself.
Yeah.
During a lot of these, because he didn't act with the virtue in which he wished he could have, and he didn't stand on the principles that he thought were so important to culture and civilization in general. And I thought that was really cool. So why don't you do this for me, sir? Who are some of the biggest Stoics, and what effect did they have on you as a student, and then obviously a professor of philosophy?
Okay, there's a multi-stranded story here, right? I first discovered the Roman Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius, like Epictetus, like Seneca. They were the second wave of Stoicism. I hadn't really discovered the original. And the way I discovered the Roman Stoics is I was traveling all over the country giving talks to business groups of every kind. I mean, one company hired me 50 times in a 2-year period. I was always on an airplane, 400, 500 airplanes a year. I take an old book and a new book with me on every airplane. The new book was, new psychology, new whatever, current events. The old book would be a book of philosophy. And so I came across the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And then not too long after that, I came across the letters of Seneca. I'd never heard of Seneca. I'd done, 2 PhDs, and I'd taught for many years in the classroom in the philosophy department. Nobody mentioned Seneca or Marcus Aurelius. Epictetus, I had never really heard of either. So these were the practical philosophers. About 150 years ago, philosophy tried to become like the natural sciences and get really logic heavy, really technical, really esoteric vocabulary. What would you like to learn? Ontology or epistemology today? It was all so heavily jargon laden. But philosophy used to be not just a way of thinking. Philosophy used to be a way of life. Right. And about 1998, Tom Wolfe wrote a best-selling book called A Man in Full. And it was about an Atlanta businessman who gets in trouble, gets thrown in prison, and he discovers Epictetus, and it changes his life. And so everybody was saying, who are the Stoics? Who is Epictetus? Because Wolfe talks about Stoicism a bunch of the book. And the publisher I had at the time for my book, If Aristotle Ran General Motors, called me and said, stop what you're doing, write a book on Stoicism in 90 days, and it'll be a #1 New York Times bestseller. I said, okay. And I turned the book in day 89. This was 1998, remember? Yeah. This was before anybody else was interested in Stoicism. I turned in the book and Wolfe's book dropped off the Times bestseller list, so our publisher's not interested anymore. So I ended up sending it to a small publishing company. It was called The Stoic Art of Living. So I tell you this part of the story because this is 1998, 1999. The book comes out, I think, in 2002. There was no general interest in Stoicism like there is now, but all of a sudden now, there's this wave of interest in business, sports, entertainment, the military, and they go back not just to the Romans, but to the Greeks. So here's the story. In about 300 BC, there was a young businessman taking a shipment full of purple dye. Royal garments were dyed purple. Purple dye was very expensive, very rare. If you cornered the market on that, you were going to do great business. And so his father was a great merchant. He was working with his father. He took basically all their money is poured into this ship full of royal purple dye, and the ship has a shipwreck, and everything is destroyed. Oof. He somehow swims to shore, dries off, makes his way to Athens, Greece. The shipwreck happens off the shore of Greece, makes his way to Athens, goes into what the equivalent then of a bookshop, and picks up something written, I think, by Xenophon, one of Socrates' students, about Socrates. And he says to the bookseller, where can I meet somebody like this? I want to learn from somebody like this. And just then a guy named Crates was walking by, a philosopher, and the bookshop guy said, go follow him. He's a philosopher. And so Zeno did. And then studied with him, studied with 2 or 3 other guys, just learned as much as he could. And he started hanging out with his friends on a porch in downtown Athens called the Painted Porch. The word for porch in Greek was stoa. And he got his friends really excited about philosophy, and he had a distinctive perspective on philosophy that got really popular. And so they started calling themselves Zenonians, which kind of doesn't fit on a t-shirt or a toga too well, so they shortened it to Stoics in honor of the porch where they were hanging out. And Zeno said, you know what? The most important thing in life is to live in accordance with nature. You know what the two most important qualities of human beings are that really set us apart from the rest of the world? The kind of rationality we have and the kind of relationality we have. Our ability to be sagacious, thoughtful, speculative, theoretical, our ability to be social, to have communities, to build organizations, to have stuff like commerce. So he came from the world of people selling stuff to other people. There was a lively world of commerce in the ancient world, all around the Mediterranean. People being sociable in productive, positive ways, right? It wasn't just about fighting wars with each other, but let's do business with each other. Let's make deals with each other. And that kind of influenced how he saw human beings. Look, when we make deals, we're being rational and we're being relational, right? We're not just making some money, but we're making relationships and we're building communities. And so he started talking about this, and he discovered stuff like, wow, the shipwreck. Most people would say that's the worst thing that could happen. So you lost all your money in shipwreck. Oh, terrible. Except it helped me become a philosopher, which is really wonderful. So don't be too quick to say of anything, oh, this is terrible, this is awful, because it might turn out to be the opposite. So he starts drawing a distinction between appearances and realities that Plato was also had been, Plato's working on the same kind of distinction. And then he says, you know what? Here's another distinction. There are two kinds of things in the world: the things that you can control and the things you can't control. Quit focusing on and fixating on the things you can't control. One more thing. In the ancient world, the main competitors, to think of philosophy as having competitors is funny, but the main competitors to the Stoics were the Epicureans. Mm-hmm. The Stoics were downtown in the marketplace. The Epicureans were out of town in a garden. And people misunderstand Epicurus as just, eat, drink, and be merry, tomorrow you'll die. But it was more like, pleasure is the most important thing in life, but you got to moderate your pleasures or you'll bring on more pains. Yep. But he thought that pleasure was the main thing. The Stoics thought that virtue is the main thing and that pleasure is a nice side effect of living a virtuous life.
Right.
And so throughout the centuries, you get the Romans, they pick up on all this. They write about it. They have this huge impact, like Marcus.
Yeah.
Because they're real human beings. The luxury site for reselling your Hermes bags, The Real. Yep. That could have been the name of Marcus Aurelius's meditations, The Real, because the dude is being authentic. He's being genuine. Like you said, he's saying, here are my principles and here's how I fall short. And I got to remind myself of what I need to be doing every day. So we're reading this guy and we're saying he's just like me. Geez, I struggle with things like that. Yeah.
That's a big piece, Professor. And I think that during one of your book interviews, you were being on your book tour, someone asked you, what is the importance of philosophy? And I'm going to quote you directly here because I was very impressed. This was your oration, by the way. So if I missed a piece, I apologize. He said, well, there is more to just the physical universe. There is an organization of the physical universe. There is something called logos. There is this rationality of something that deepens things. And the inner is really the foundation for the outer. And character is everything in this world. Inner virtue, inner strength. We should think about who we are before we're even thinking about what we want to do, because we've got to build a foundation for the soul, for all these things that people chase in the outer world.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really cool.
Thanks.
And you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think that's really where the virtue piece comes in. And if there's anything that I could say that is probably integral or even just the fulcrum of Stoicism, it is inner virtue. I think the importance of that, and I'm a layperson, but why don't you elaborate on that piece for me? Because I really thought that was powerful.
Well, you're a wise layperson, because there are contemporary Stoics who put their finger on the wrong thing as the center of Stoicism. They'll say it's about self-control, or they'll say it's about not worrying. They'll say it's about inner peace. But for the Stoics themselves, it was always about virtue. And all that other stuff was either to protect virtue or would result from virtue. But it's virtuous living at the core. Their main hero, these guys, was Socrates, interestingly. They all look back to Socrates. And in fact, they had this principle: always have a historical figure that you admire that you could say, okay, what would Socrates do in these situations? How would Socrates react? And so they look back to Socrates a lot. And Socrates was famous for walking the streets of Athens and saying things like this, according to Plato: "Man of Athens, you're a citizen of the greatest city in the history of the world. Why is it all you care about is money and fame? You never give any attention to the state of your own soul." And people thought, what? Does Socrates have a problem with money? Does Socrates have a problem with fame? No, he had a problem with people chasing external things like money and fame before building a solid foundation in the soul. Because guess what? If you get the money and fame, you're going to misuse them. They'll become a curse, not a blessing for you. And boy, haven't we seen that play out in our time.
Every day. Yes. I mean, in almost every situation, that's kind of the lottery winner problem, right?
Yeah, it's the lottery winner problem, right? People, and I saw this with my students at Notre Dame. Notre Dame did a pretty good job of preparing their great football players, for example, going into pro ball and getting lots of money. How are you going to handle this money? How are you going to handle yourself? How are you going to handle your desires, your wants as distinct from your needs? How are you going to be prudent, which is a part of, which is one of the great 4 cardinal virtues, prudential wisdom, being, knowing how to take care of your self-management. In fact, a friend of mine who coaches presidents of companies, he said when he first got into coaching, it was all about solving whatever problem they brought to him. And then he realized that all the problems had something in common. They all arose typically because of a lack of self-awareness and a lack of self-management.
Yeah.
Well, Socrates famously said, know yourself, self-awareness. And the Stoics came up then and said, and manage yourself, self-management. Those two things, between the Socratics and the Stoics, you got the formula. If we saw more people in modern life who have money and fame and power and status, if we saw more people with great self-awareness and great self-management, half the problems of the world would just disappear suddenly. And the philosophers had the formula. They had the magic. And all we've got to do is draw from that well. It's a deep well, and it's a well full of pure, refreshing water. And that's why I say to people, look, we don't have to make it all up ourselves. We've got these great people who've come before us, these really wise people, these really smart people. Let's see what they said. Now, they weren't always right, Joey. I like to make this point. I was on a podcast with Modern Stoicism lately, and fans of Stoicism for all over the world. It was this huge group of people, and I had to make the point that I hadn't heard anybody else make, that the Stoics, like anybody else, that they don't get everything right. No. Right? They were wrong about something like Zeno. It's never mentioned by other Stoics nowadays, people who self-identify. So it's never mentioned that he believed in cannibalism. He was a believer in cannibalism. And I pointed out on the podcast, I said, it's not as if he invited you over for dinner, you'd have to be scared to death. But if you were to have an unfortunate accident along the way, hey, the grill's on and it's all protein. I mean, that was his attitude. They believed in sex is fine between consenting people, no matter the age. Right. So if you could get some really young person to say, sure, fine, that's fine. And if it's a cousin, that's fine. If it's your brother or sister, your mother, father, your child, that's fine too. It's like, what? Yeah. So they didn't get everything right. And
well, Seneca, as an example, had to deal with the nonsense of dealing with all that advice to Nero.
Right.
Right. I mean, who was a complete lunatic. So, I mean, obviously there's issues around, what goes on there. And I think that's really where, speaking of right and wrong, obviously in our body politic today, we have a new House Speaker who's very religious. Mike Johnson is a very religious person, almost a fundamentalist on that front. The Stoics often spoke of logos, God, the gods, Zeus, providence, benevolent nature, whatever you want to call it. You want to talk a little bit about the importance of, and it's God. It's not spirituality. Right? There's a difference there. They genuinely believe, and I don't exactly know which God they're talking to,
It's not always clear, and sometimes they vacillate a little bit. Sometimes they'll use current language like the gods, or they'll use the God, or they'll just use logos, which, a lot of people don't know. The Gospel of John in the Christian New Testament, chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos became human. Okay, they were using the logos as God. And sometimes in the Stoics, it sounds like a version of sort of pantheism. God is the software of the universe's hardware, something like that, like AI almost, and God is the ultimate AI. But in other times, it sounds like they're dealing with God more as a distinct personal being who creates and governs the world. So there was a lot of that sort of philosophical religion. And it's funny because the word religion comes from Latin religio, which means to tie to tether to. Are there values that you tether your life to? Is there anything stable in your life? That's your religio. And some people take it in crazy directions. The Stoics believe that we couldn't know all divine intent. There are a lot of people these days who think they know everything. God told me to do this and God told me to do that. I'm going to be speaker because God said, Tom, go be speaker of the house. And the Stoics weren't like that at all. They realized there's mystery in the world.
Okay.
But behind that mystery, there's deep structure, there's deep logic, there's deep value. They wanted to plug into the logic and the value and the structure without pretending to know more than they did.
Well, that's important because I think there's, they talk a lot about that specifically with, dispreferred indifference, which I thought was a phrase that you talked about in your book. Do you want to explain what that means to our listeners? Because that's pretty important piece to this theory.
Yeah. So some of the early Stoics said, look, the only things that are good or bad have to do with your own will, the inner thing, vice and virtue. Vice is bad, virtue is good. Everything else is indeterminate or indifferent. They had this view, very few things are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. Most things, their value consists in how you use them. I call that the functionality principle. How does it function in your life, Joey? That'll show us whether it's good or bad. Oh, I want to get a lot of money. Well, that's not intrinsically good. It's all a matter of how it will function in your life. It could be very good or it could be bad. Except the early Stoics said, well, let's don't even call that stuff good or bad. Let's only call stuff good if it's always good. And let's only call stuff bad if it's always bad. And since most things can be either, it'll finally just come back to the will and the character of the will, whether vice or virtue. Vice is always bad and virtue is always good. So everything else is what? Indifferent. What was their friend said? What about health? What about the safety of your family? What about, okay. That stuff is not on the same level of vice and virtue, but okay, it's preferred. So nature creates us in such a way, and Zeno said, live in accordance with nature. Nature created us in such a way that we should want to preserve our lives under most conditions. We should want the safety of our family. We should want many things. Okay, those things, let's don't call them strictly good or bad. Let's save that for virtue and vice. Let's call those preferred or dispreferred. So to live a natural life, it's preferred to have resources like some money. It's preferred to have shelter, like a nice place to live. It's preferred to have education for your children so they can develop their reason and their relationality. A lot of things are preferred and a lot of things are dispreferred. We don't call them evil because some of those dispreferred things can come into your life. For example, a businessman ends up in jail, like in Tom Wolfe's book. He's lost everything. He's in a situation that he thinks of as terrible, as awful, as unmitigated bad. It's just an evil situation that he's being deprived of everything that matters to him. The Stoics would say, no, slow down. It's a dispreferred situation. But even in that situation, what matters more than the situation? In other words, what happens more than what happens to you? What matters more is what happens in you in that situation. So how are you going to respond to that being in jail? How are you going to respond to losing your business to bankruptcy? How are you going to respond to losing your house or your spouse leaving you? Oh, this is terrible. This is terrible. No, slow down. Quit putting labels like terrible on it. Say, yeah, it was dispreferred. It's not to be preferred. But now that it's in your life, The question is, what are you going to do with it? And that was this judo move of the intellect and the emotions that most people at the time and even now will say, whoa, I never thought about it like that. So even in what we consider the worst circumstances, it's still up to me. I still got freedom of my will, how I'm going to respond. And I can rebuild my life. I can rebuild something really great. I can rebuild, as long as I'm virtuous and not vicious in this situation, I can turn it into, well, like the book I did a few years ago that we've talked about before, Lemons to Lemonade, Plato's lemonade stand.
Yeah.
I can take these lemons and turn them into lemonade. Well, that's what the Stoics were all about.
That's a fascinating piece because Epictetus famously said, I was never more free than when I was on the rack. Right. And that goes back to, if you want to take someone who's in the zeitgeist today, Mike Tyson, who's about to fight Jake Paul in July. He said he's never been happier than when he was in prison and broke.
Yeah, right.
And he talks about that in interviews for the same reason, I would assume. Thousands of years between these two men, where one says, I was never been happier when I was on the rack, and one was like, never been happier when I was broke and in prison.
Yeah.
And Tyson talks about specifically what we just mentioned, which is if you're really into money and that's your thing, and you acquire it. I've seen it happen.
Yeah.
With people who didn't understand what to do with it.
Yeah.
They live paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
They grew up poor, most likely abused at some level. And then when they get this money, it's like, ooh, cars, clothes, women. And you see this with sports figures all the time, right?
Yeah,
and they get a $20 million contract or $100 million today, and they blow through it. It's gone. They get caught. They're in jail. They're doing drugs. They're impregnating women outside of their wives. They ruin their life.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
With money.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
It didn't help them. I always say, having money enhances who you are. So if you're in a good place, that's fantastic. I think the beauty of money, and someone who grew up poor, I wasn't happy with the poverty side of life. And when I was fortunate enough to make a good living someday, I was like, oh, this is cool. But I did the same thing in the beginning. Just, cars, clothes, girls, the first class airfare, and you just, wow, okay, I got to close. I got to shut this down. This isn't good. And the excess of it was, I think, part of the core philosophy of the Stoics, which was, hey, virtue versus vice, right? We need to stick with that. And I think that may be, a good place for us to graduate to, how is this affecting our current culture today? As you know, I interview a lot of academics, yourself included, and a lot of politicians and journalists and other folks specifically about our body politic. What is going on today in 2024 politics? How, our founding fathers, which we've talked about this off camera, but they were inspired by the writings of John Locke. They followed the Greeks. They're famously known as a group of philosophers, statesmen, and they used a lot of philosophy specific to, the Magna Carta obviously helped, but what we were doing as far as getting things drafted, what do we want to be as a country? What do we stand for? All of those things are kind of moored in the foundations of the Stoics and the philosophers of old, specifically the Greeks. Where did we lose too much? I mean, if you fast forward and have, someone like, and it doesn't matter, even John Locke, witness what we're seeing today. And this isn't a partisan thing. This is a mess across the board, right? We're just not getting along anymore. What happened? Where did we lose some of this? And we talked about this off camera too, is the death of expertise part of this? And do we hate the elites because they know so much and they don't know anything because they're just theoretical and they're in these ivory towers, and because of that, they don't tell us what to do? I mean, what happened in this regard? And let me say one more thing before that, because Lincoln was once quoted as saying about a member of Congress, I really don't like that man. I guess I should get to know him better.
Yeah, right. And can you imagine that being said by anybody in our current?
No, because I mean, when we talked about this before in a former podcast, we were talking about the dangers of ideologies. If you look at even Ronald Reagan, who I think we can all agree was a small C conservative that most people liked, right? Obviously people, they have their detractors on every side of the things, but Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House. they were buddies.
Yeah.
Right? They disagreed politically, but they were still like boys.
Oh, yeah.
They'd have their cigars and their whiskeys together and have dinner, and they would say, "Hey, Ronnie, I need your help on this," and he'd be like,
Yeah.
"Okay, Tip, but I need your help on this. I need you to get your constituents over here." And but they were working together, and when they didn't get along, they figured out what it is they didn't like about each other. And we don't have that anymore. We have such a separation of parties that it is no longer an option to even work with the other side. The olive branch is lit on fire.
Yeah.
As opposed to being extended. When did we, 80s was Tip O'Neill and Reagan. When did we lose this as far as you can see? When did we start to have this level of acrimony that I think just continues to get worse?
Yeah, it started decades ago, right? And there was a professor at Columbia, Hofstadter, who wrote a famous book in the 50s called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. One of the best books I've ever read. Yeah, I read it in the early 60s.
But I remember the book.
Yeah. And when I read this book, I thought it's amazing that we even have schools and universities, because there's so much animus against theory, against the intellectual life. We were a nation of practical people, but there's nothing more practical than wisdom. So how did we go wrong on that? Well, until about the turn of the 20th century, from around the late 1800s, early 1900s, every educated person had read some philosophy, and they had read especially some Stoic philosophy. They knew Seneca, they knew Marcus Aurelius. It was widely understood amongst the people who then rise into leadership positions. They understood Aristotle's position that politics is about how best to live well together. What a concept. And so out of sync with the way people view politics now as blood sport, Yeah. No, politics, how best to live well together. People in partnership for a shared purpose. Let's create the best life together we can. That's the Aristotelian view. Now, Plato, Aristotle's teacher, was worried about democracy, because he believed that if everybody gets to vote, then what if there's a shyster, a con man who comes along and says everything that people want to hear, but he has no expertise, he has no moral compass, he has nothing to make him a leader, and yet they will. It's like a ship. It's like members of in the Republic. Plato gives an example. Suppose the guys in the ship say, "Well, why should the captain be a captain? We know as much as he does. Let's throw the captain overboard. We'll run the ship." Well, no, they don't. They know how to get the sails up or down, but they don't know how to steer the ship and all this. And then a con man comes along saying everything they want to hear, and they say, "Yeah, you run the ship." Well, he doesn't know anything any more than they do. So this whole idea of expertise, losing track of that, somehow equating expertise with elitism, which is bad.
Right.
These scientists, they claim they know all this stuff. What do they know? Well, they had to work really hard. It's like journalism, same thing. Journalists and scientists, it's just anybody saying anything they want to say. And we're supposed to believe them? No, they are trained in how to discover truth and how to eliminate illusion and falsehood, and how to double check and triple check. And look, in what you do as a farmer or in what you do as a truck driver, don't you want to check your brakes? Don't you want to check your tires? Do you want to take your car to just anybody to work on, or your truck, or don't you want to take it to somebody who knows what he's doing, right? It's like, that's a simple principle. That's what expertise is all about. And in politics, our founding fathers had steeped themselves in the wisdom of the ages, because that's what a good education was about at that point in time. And as we've drifted away from that, as we've drifted into, well, let's just teach them what will get them a job. Let's just throw a little bit of civics at them, how a bill becomes a law, and let's just teach them how to get a job, and good luck to you, Well, yeah, good luck to all of us, because if we don't know these basic principles, like, for example, Joey, there was a Stoic hardly anybody's heard of named Heracles. And I talk about him in my book, The Everyday Patriot, because he's so important. He says, your life, my life, everybody's life can be mapped by a set of concentric circles, like an archery target with an inner circle and one next to the rings that go out.
Yep.
Your innermost circle is your own heart and mind. Get those as healthy as you possibly can. Feed your mind with great ideas. Feed your heart with great feelings and attitudes. And then you can contribute your little circle to the next circle out, which is your family and your closest friends and your closest colleagues. Make that circle as strong and as healthy as it can possibly be. Then you can contribute to the next circle out, which is your neighborhood or your general workplace and your town and your state and your nation and your world. So each circle should contribute to the next circle out, and each outer circle should then reach back and support those inner circles that try to make it so healthy. We're not supposed to be at war with each other. We're supposed to be partnering with each other to make good things happen.
And isn't that part of, philosophy in general? Debate has always been a big thing with philosophers, right? I mean, that's the one thing. I had a couple of buddies that took philosophy in college, and that was the running joke where they'd be under a tree playing frisbees and talking about words and semantics and arguing about what the word truth means. That was part of it. And the debate that I remember back then was spirited, and it was fun. And Epictetus actually has, and I quote here, "We are taught to debate, not how to live."
Yeah.
Right. So there's a big piece there. And I would offer up today as a culture, debate is also in danger because you're not even allowed to talk about things that go outside the orthodoxy of your specific religion, your camp, if you will. So if you have someone on the left that talks about something, someone on the right throws a question at them, then, well, how dare you even question my orthodoxy? And you're like, well, no, that's not the point. The whole point of politics in general is the art of the possible. Right. That was the original piece that it meant, right? I mean, after Aristotle, but you look at that and think, oh, okay, well, what are we doing today with regards to that? And this maybe leads to something that I think happens in both areas of our body is that you talked on page 100 of your book about virtue signaling, and you use words like rhetorical performance art, which I loved, by the way, because we are seeing this in living color every day. I see it on my feeds. I see it in college campuses today where you can't debate anything, because if you do, you're a racist and a xenophobe and a transphobe and a terrible person, and how dare you? And it's like, why did you decide to write about virtue signaling in a book about Stoicism?
Yeah, right. I know.
I was fascinated by that because I was like, oh, good for them.
So it's funny the way we divided things up because I was asked to do this book. They called me and they asked me to do this book in 9 months to write a 384-page book. And I was doing a lot of other things too. And I said, well, I don't have time to do this, but what a great idea for there to be a book like this in the series. So I emailed one of my old students, one of my old grad students, who was one of my teaching assistants at Notre Dame, and he had a distinguished career of his own. That's how old I am. And he's retired from teaching now, but he retired young. And I said, hey, dude, you want to write a book about the Stoics together? And he said, weird that you ask. I've been doing a deep dive in Stoicism for about 4 months now. I just decided to write my own book. And I said, well, you want to do it together? He said, yeah, let's do it together. So I said, he was mostly a historian. He did a big coffee table book for Barnes & Noble called The Philosophy Book, History of Philosophy. And he's kind of a historian. I'm kind of a conceptual guy. So I said, Greg, why don't you write the history chapters up front? I'll write the introduction, maybe chapter 1, and then you do the history of the Greeks and the Romans, and then I'll take over most of the conceptual chapters, and then you'll do the history of modern Stoicism, like in the last 50 years or something. And he said, great, but we both contributed to each other's chapters. So that virtue signaling insert came up when I was writing a chapter on virtue and the Greeks' ideals about virtue. And most people don't even hear the word or use the word virtue anymore, except in the context of yelling at each other online that you're just virtue signaling.
Right.
They've sort of that's become a thing. That's become a convenient label to slap on anybody who's advocating a moral stance that you disagree with or that somehow you feel threatened by. You say, all you're doing is virtue signaling. You're trying to perform for the crowd. You're trying to get people to say, oh, yay, he believes what I believe. And you know what? Some of the people who accuse others of virtue signaling, they're doing this converse for their own crowd. It's kind of a vice signaling that's become a virtue signaling. All they're doing is they're trying to perform it. It's performative rhetoric for their side of the aisle. Yeah, you get those virtue signalers. Well, he himself is doing virtue, the very thing he's accusing the other person, often wrongly, of doing, he's doing, so we're in a weird time where most people hear the word virtue, an ancient concept of strength, in the context of a critique, in a phrase, virtue signaling. So virtue signaling is a bad thing. Virtue must be a bad thing too. No, it's the opposite of that. So that's how far we've gone, Joey. And the answer is there are a lot of cultural forces pushing in this direction. I think teachers do their very best jobs. Most of the teachers, I used to do seminars for the National Endowment for the Humanities, seminars for school teachers K through 12, bring 15 of the best teachers in America to Notre Dame for part of a summer, and we'd live together, think together. I was so impressed by teachers, but they are so constrained in so many ways. And now there are all these parent groups that'll show up at the city council or the school board and, have these protests and screamed horrible things at people. And the teachers are like, what am I supposed to be doing? It's like I have too many people who are telling me what to do now, and they can't really convey wisdom and virtue to their kids. America has never been perfect. We've always been far from it. But there have been times when we were better at practical life wisdom in the classroom. And we've kind of abandoned that. And I think we're seeing the consequences.
Specifically with that virtue signaling chapter, what do you think? How do we get back to the proper term? How do we reimagine the word virtue specific to, because to your point, it is more of a pejorative word now in our conversations. And virtue itself is I think the most important part. Whether you liked, Obama as a president, as an example, he seemed to be steeped in virtue. He also seemed to be very well educated. So there's a lot of very valid critiques of his presidency, by the way. Yeah,
sure.
I've done a lot
Nobody does everything right. The Stoics didn't do everything right. Plato
wasn't a bad guy, right? Yeah. And there was, as well as I do, that if he did something bad, they'd have found out because they wanted to find out.
So badly, right?
Today,
if you do anything, we live at a time where if you do anything wrong, don't wear that beige suit. If you do anything wrong, then you do everything wrong.
I wish we had a beige suit problem today with our
don't you wish that was the problem?
I know. Yeah. Well, if you look back at Karl Rove, back when he was trying to get George W. Bush propped up to be president, he was terrified about the DUI.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? I mean, these are simpler times. It's 2000, it's only 25 years ago, but you look at that and go, oh, okay, he was terrified of a DUI on his resume.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter anymore about what's going on. There's a great show on CNN, Jake Tapper. It's like something about scandal, American Scandal, United States of Scandal, something like that.
Yeah.
I'm butchering the name. But he did a specials on politicians. And he did one on, he did one on Elliot Spitzer. Which was just brutal. And it really talks to, and this show is fantastic for our listeners because it really shows you what power does.
Yeah.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it was one of those things where every single person featured on the show collapses based on the lack of virtue, lack of ethics, lack of morals. Right. And John Edwards may be the worst example of this. He might have been the presidential candidate in 2008 instead of Barack Obama, except for what he did. And I don't know, and you remember this, but my listeners who didn't, he was having an affair with a staffer.
Yeah.
While his wife was riddled with cancer.
Yeah.
Then got the staffer pregnant. Then decided to ask his colleague on his staff to take the hit for him. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Say it's your baby. And he did all of this while simultaneously campaigning to be the president of the United States. Now, I'm not a doctor, but those are some sociopathic tendencies that you could actually, on one side of the coin, go and do this and then run for president. And then it gets worse. So after he was booted to the table, after Obama was up, he then asked Obama if he could be his vice president or his actual AG. So he didn't even see anything wrong with what he was doing. Yeah. Right. And this is I wanted to just kind of illustrate this because our politics has had these kind of characters forever. We obviously have a character like that in our body politic today, and Mr. Trump. It doesn't matter anymore what you do or what you say or where you come from or the importance of that. And I think that's the hard part for me is it, and this is not a long-term, this is a long-term fix. Is it something you believe as an advocate for philosophy and Stoicism? Should we teach this to our children? Because there's the big debate around, ethical studies and Black studies. And, to me, I think a lot of that sounds wonderful. Like, hey, let's teach about the culture and let's teach about how Blacks have been oppressed, from the origin of our country. I get that. I have no problem with that. Problem is that we're running way too far with it on many fronts, and no one's listening. So what about philosophy? If we're starting to teach other things, is philosophy, should it be a core component to our children?
I really think so. And I don't say that because I'm a philosopher. I'm a philosopher because I believe that. It's the other way around. And I do think it's just basic equipment for living well, right? It's back to Plato and Aristotle. It's back to Socrates. Learn how to examine yourself, learn how to question yourself, learn the self-awareness, the self-knowledge. And if we teach kids how to do that, we help them avoid a lot of problems they're going to fall into. And the thing about John Edwards, it's funny, you can see this creep of people getting away with more and more stuff and not getting into the kind of trouble you would think they would get into. They got the DUI years ago. You remember the guy named Gary who was photographed on a boat called Hanky Panky?
Gary Hart.
That torpedoed his president, right? And so
one affair, which seems so banal today, right? You're like, you had one affair? You didn't cheat on your first wife with your second wife and your second wife with your third wife?
I've lived 200 years because I can remember I sat in a hotel lobby with him once and his wife and my wife, and we had this long conversation about philosophy. He was trained actually in Catholic philosophy, so he knew a lot about ancient philosophy, which I mentioned because it doesn't mean just because you study philosophy, you'll never make mistakes in your life.
No.
But if we had people in politics who, despite their mistakes, insisted on living a reflective life and examining their mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes. In fact, I like to say my little metaphor for this is I live high atop a mountain of my own mistakes from which I can see far. And I wish more people would adopt that attitude. We're not trying to keep you from making mistakes. We're not trying to keep you from being human. We're trying to equip you to learn from those mistakes so you don't repeat them or make them worse. And if we could have people in political life, in leadership positions in the corporate world, who had this kind of self-awareness and self-management, this kind of ability to be reflective about their own lives. Is this really working the way I'm doing this here? I mean, think about the people Sam Bankman-Fried, think about Sam Altman, think about all the tempests and teapots left and right with Elon and everybody. It's like we don't have people at the top in any sector who are showing wisdom and virtue the way the ancients wanted to see it in people in leadership positions.
Yeah, and they always say, the speed of the lead is the speed of the pack is dictated by the speed of the leader, right? So if our leaders are problematic, it's an issue. And there was also another famous quote around Plato that philosophy did not find Plato already a nobleman; it made him one, right?
Yeah.
So it's like those are the kind of things that I look at, and maybe I'm Pollyanna in that sense because I wrote a memoir about being a douchebag, right?
Yeah, it's a great memoir, and it's a great example of exactly what I was just talking about, learning from our mistakes, right? And overcoming, transforming ourselves in response to those mistakes, and we become greater, better, and inwardly richer than we could have been if we hadn't made those mistakes.
Right, and I actually think, because the book itself chronicled my less than optimal upbringing, and some of my insecurities, specifically when I started making money, spending it and being an idiot. And I think the reason that book was so important was it was cathartic for me to write, but I wrote it for my kids. And I want them to read it someday because they're very privileged kids. They have a really easy life. And I wanted them to know, hey, not everyone grows up like you guys and with two loving parents and a doting uncle and grandparents and a village around you and, all of that. And the idea there is that, and what I think would be more effective for politicians is if they just admit it. If you just admit when you screw up, people be like, oh, whoa. Would almost be taken aback by like, that was super cool. And an example of this, as you know, I reported on defund the police and gender ideology, harm reduction policies, just very complex, very contentious topics over the last
all the hot button issues, basically. You have anything for finding these, I
would just get hammered, right? I would see my feed light up and you're a racist and you're a jerk and you're a douchebag. And some guy actually said, you're just a douchebag. And he didn't know I wrote a book called Joey Somebody, The Life and Times of a Recovering Douchebag, right? So he texted me and he said, he called me a racist. It was because I was pushing back on the narrative of defund the police and why I thought it was wrong and all the issues endemically. Yeah. And I thought it would be clever, and I respond to all of them. Yeah. I usually invite them on the show because I want someone to come on the show and belittle me if they can, or tell me what I'm doing wrong because I do things wrong. But I said to him on the email back, I said, hey, just to be clear, I'm not a douchebag. I'm the douchebag. And then I put a link to my book. And he sent me back a note. 8 seconds later, he goes, oh my God, dude, new subscriber. That was the greatest response ever. And it was like, I won him over instantly because I was like, hey, dude, you want to point out that I'm problematic, a big word we use today, but come and tell me. If you believe I'm a racist because I'm pushing back on a narrative around defund the police, after you watch the show, right? I interviewed police officers and politicians and people from the DNC here in Sacramento. I interviewed, young men and women in college campuses. I did a very thorough examination of this and why it was wrong. And it was. And in hindsight, it turned out it was. But that's the kind of thing, I think that level of humility, that level of introspection where you're just like, oh man, I know I can be a knucklehead. I know I make mistakes. I know I screw up. We don't have that anymore.
That's why you responded so well to Marcus Aurelius's meditations, because you were doing what Marcus did. You were both being honest, self-reflective. Look, I'm trying my best. Welcome critics, because they may point out something about us we haven't realized yet.
Yeah.
But if they're wrong, you don't have to fight about it. You can just, point out you understand where they're coming from and what they're trying to get at. Yeah. But they may have missed the target they were shooting at, in which case the guy that, and then he changes his attitude altogether. Because the thing about Marcus Aurelius, he had this rare combination. I call it nobility and humility. Nobility, you have high aspirations, deep values. You think the best about everybody else that they will possibly allow you to think about them. But then humility, you don't have it all figured out. You make mistakes. You do stuff wrong, and you own up to it as soon as it happens, as soon as it's pointed out to you. And why can't more people be like that? We're not talking about everybody becoming a neuroscientist or everybody becoming an astronaut. We're talking about some fairly easy things here.
Yeah. And
yet, look at how hugely different the world would be if we could just do some simple things right.
Yeah, I think so too. And maybe we can end on this, because I really enjoyed this. You and Greg did a really good job, your co-author, of not only explaining and reframing things for the layperson, but even for someone like me who studied philosophy for years, I really enjoyed how you broke it all down. And at the end of the book, in chapter 22 specifically, you guys highlighted 10 great Stoic blogs, which I think are amazing. And I'll put it in the show notes. But you mentioned a guy specifically named Ryan Holiday.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
Which I really liked, because my listeners know that I spent 20 years in the ad biz. And I spent a lot of time at conferences and speaking, just like you, about advertising. And Ryan, I've followed since 2014, because he was the former director of marketing at a company called American Apparel. I don't know if you remember that, but
the people who could sell underwear with nude models. Go figure.
Well, right. And he was responsible for that, and he was responsible for the blogging and the actual social media, because back then that was really new.
Yeah,
this was really new, and he was very clever. Many people
really young then.
Well, yeah, because he's a young guy now. But he was, I don't know, but he was 30, maybe even younger. But he was not well respected after he. Oh, by the way, he wrote a book. I shouldn't say he wasn't well respected. I'm going to rephrase that. he had a lot of detractors after he wrote a book called "Trust Me, I'm Lying."
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And it was a hilarious book, tragically funny, to be clear. It was dark in the sense that he talked about his time in digital marketing and how he utilized tools and blogs and technology and the human condition to take advantage.
Yeah.
And he did. I mean, he did a lot of stuff that he talks about being unethical and immoral.
Yeah.
And I mention that not to poo-poo him, because I like this young man. I watch him. He has the Daily Stoic on Instagram. He comes up every day and he has little sound bites of Marcus Aurelius and Zeno and Epictetus.
Right.
And
absolutely.
it's really good. And what I wanted to kind of get from you on this is that he seems to be, and gone through the same metamorphosis that I did, is that after he made a good, God found himself in a good job and making good money and realized that he did some things he regretted, he kind of was like, you know what, I'm going to revamp my life. He moved to outside of Austin, Texas, somewhere. It's like a very, he owns a bunch of property. He's got, animals and acres, and he's a very simplistic guy that way. He's not, overly showy. He's not driving a Ferrari and living in, a penthouse with gold-plated toilets. He's just it seems to be like a guy who's gone through a metamorphosis. And so I wanted to get your take on that, because I really like him. Do you think folks like Ryan are picking the fruit of the long-rooted tree of philosophy?
Yeah, they are, and the Stoics are really lucky. They got an ad guy, PR guy, marketing guy like Ryan, right?
Yeah,
because he knew all the tricks, and he's been the foot soldier for Stoicism for a very long time now, with books like "The Obstacle is the Way," "Ego is the Enemy," "Stillness is the Key." He sent me a few years ago. He sent me all his books on Stoicism, and I did something with him on his blog, because he told me, he said, blog goes out to 400,000 people. Would I like to be interviewed? And this is way before Stoicism for Dummies. This is because of the Stoic Art of Living. And so I got to know him a little bit that way. And Bastrop, Texas, I mean,
that's
not,
where it is. Yeah.
Not LA, not New York,
not New York City.
You're gonna see him with a donkey, not with a Lambo, exactly. A lamb, not a Lambo.
Right.
And so, he seems to really, and the book that he says turned him around was Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, the one we keep talking about. There have been 3 or 4 new translations recently. And by the way, here's how big Stoicism is now. So a year or 2 ago, Audi does a new commercial for the Q5 SUV, and the Q5, this young woman is driving this Q5 through this beautiful landscape, and she pulls up in front of a house, and she takes something out of the car and puts it on the porch. And it's a copy, close up, it's a copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And it's got a little Post-it note on it that, if you look at it close, says, "Deliver yourself." And she gets back in the car and drives away. The new Audi Q5.
Wow, I didn't know. That's a cool
Reddit blew up around this commercial. What does it mean, deliver yourself? Is she delivering the book she taking a book back to her ex that belongs to her ex, and she's saying, you got to use this wisdom to deliver yourself. If she's delivering it so that he can deliver it, what is all this? And so Audi got so much engagement online about this commercial. And then Paul Giamatti, one of my favorite actors, comes out with The Holdovers, or whatever the name of the new movie is.
Oh, right.
At Christmas time, he's a teacher the kids who can't go home for the holidays, who have to stay at this prep school, this boarding school, he gives a Christmas present to every student. It's a copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. That's how big it's gotten now.
Yeah.
And so we can take that as a spark of hope, that if this fire spreads amongst the entertainment crowd, the military, the business crowd, the sports crowd, everybody wants to know about Stoicism. Good. Because even if they don't understand it perfectly right away, they'll be exposed to some great ideas that can change their lives. And character and culture are 2 interesting things. The culture of a business is related to the character of the people in that business. The culture of a nation is related to the character of the people in that nation. In a sense, culture is the character of an organization. And so the culture influences our characters, but our characters influence the culture. So if we can help people turn it around on a character level in massive ways, because really 12 people were reading the Stoics 20 years ago. Now thousands of people. Now Ryan sells millions of books, and Stoicism for Dummies They tell me that just took off as soon as the first day it was out, January 11th. And they were amazed at the pre-sales, and they were amazed at the initial sales. And even some people were not getting their books delivered. They were getting notices, delivery delay notification.
Mine was delayed. Yeah.
Well, it's not supposed to be. It wasn't at the time supposed to be public knowledge, but I guess it's okay now. But my editor called me and told me that an Amazon truck full of copies of the book had disappeared. And here's the phrase: an investigation is underway.
Oh my God!
Even the crooks are interested in Stoicism for Dummies.
Exactly. That's fantastic.
So if the Sopranos want to see a truck on the side of the road,
hey, Johnny Bag of Donuts, check this out. You read about Stoicism. It's the best way to make yourself better.
Hey, these guys were Italians. You know?
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, I got to tell you, sir, I think that this is a good way to end it, because we need folks like Ryan Holiday out there talking about the Stoics. We need folks like you out there doing the same thing. So I always appreciate my time with you. I'll always appreciate your mentorship over the years specific to philosophy. And thanks again for coming on the show, because this is exactly what I wanted to get across to our listeners. So thank you again, sir, for your time and your wisdom.
Man, it's always so much fun, Joey. I never know what you can always come up with great stuff, and we have fun with it. So anytime you want to drag me back on this show,
I sure will.
Laughing and cheering about it. This is all great, man. I really believe in it.
Thanks, man. Me too.